Dear class of Education and Sustainability, in this presentation we make a full circle in the course. We revisit themes that we discussed at the beginning of the semester, such as modernity, coloniality, and its possible alternatives in the form of sustainability and decoloniality. And in this presentation I retake the idea that just as different communities have different histories and are embedded in different ecosystems, and just as individuals have different needs and talents, so should there be a large variety of ways of learning that need to be honored, that go way beyond the homogenized monoculture imposed by the modern school. I will devote my presentation to exploring some of the ideas expressed in the book Scaping Education, Living as Learning Within Grassroots Cultures, written by Madhu Prakash and Gustavo Esteva, and published in 1998. Prakash is a professor at the College of Education at Penn State University, and Esteva is a deprofessionalized intellectual living in Mexico, and one of the founders of the University of the Soil in the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. The word tierra means several things in Spanish. It means earth, land, and soil all in one. Unitierra, as the university is known, is not a university in the Western sense of the word. There are no formal credits or formal diplomas or even formal students. Unitierra is more a community where people gather together to learn about a specific theme. It's a space where people get together to learn, to reflect, and to act. In the Western model of the university, and of schooling in general, pedagogy is based on how we teach and how students learn, which is measured by basically grades. The idea is that the higher the grade, the higher the learning, regardless if such is the case. At Unitierra, they decided to consciously move away from the theoretical and conceptual framework of pedagogical science, so as not to reproduce the known vices of the modern system of education, and to concentrate their efforts in the process of learning, rather than that of teaching. The theory and practice at Unitierra has been nurtured by the work of indigenous communities in Mexico and elsewhere, as well as by authors such as Paul Goodman, John Holt, Gustavo Esteva, and Ivan Illich, among others. Going back to the book Scaping Education, it's an educational manifesto on behalf of the poor, the vulnerable, the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, the voiceless, the people of the two-thirds world, the social majorities. It is a treatise that calls for rethinking the role of formal education for the quote-unquote uneducated, miseducated, and undereducated. It's a book that doesn't call for more education, or even a different type of education, but rather a different way of understanding development and understanding learning. Drawing upon and synthesizing the pedagogical critiques put forth by people such as the Indian philosopher and activist Mahatma Gandhi, the philosopher of the deschooling movement Ivan Illich, and the philosopher and environmentalist Wendell Berry, Prakash and Esteva call for the dehomogenization of societies by advocating the reinstatement of forms of learning that are rooted in the places and local societies in which people live. In other words, they are advocating for the deschooling of humanity, following Ivan Illich's title of his famous book published in 1971. The authors provide a radical critique of public institutions and policies, including those related to schooling, that are presumed to promote political and social ideals of mobility, freedom, human rights, and social justice, yet often have the consequence of devaluing the local knowledge and ways of knowing that are embedded in people's everyday lives. This work is similar to that of the Modernity Coloniality group, which we discussed at the beginning of the semester. While this group didn't speak much about schooling per se, it nonetheless shares with the deschooling movement the idea that modernity, and in this case schooling, has been instrumental in uprooting and alienating people from their places of origin, a key element of coloniality. The people who are alienated include both those who have the cultural capital to do well in school, and also those whose cultural background does not fit well into the narrative of the traditional school. The project of global development dates only to the 1940s, with the end of World War II. But since then, all countries have jumped into the bandwagon of development and progress. And as we stated at the beginning of the semester, in the 20th century, countries became divided into developed and developing countries. And developing countries like Mauritania have been playing catch up since then. The concept of poverty, at least what we understand by poverty today, is a very modern one. Poverty was non-existent in cultures that maintained and shared equitably their cultural and biological commons. It is only through the exploitative process of imperialism and colonization, in which one's common resources were and are taken away from the community, transformed them into commodities, and then sold back to them at prices they couldn't afford, that poverty really started. If we follow this logic, poor countries would take centuries to reach the wealthier ones, as in the case of Mauritania, which would take 3,223 years to reach the level of the US. Education itself became a product of this commodification, since the knowledge and skill to flourish in every society was as free as non-polluted air, and it was shared freely between the people of the community. Education today is only valuable because it functions on a model of scarcity. That is to say, it is only valuable because most are presumed not to have it. Another reason argued by Prakash and Steva to deschool society relates to the environmental crisis. Schools contribute to this problem by removing the child from community and nature, and by framing the discourse of education in terms of its importance for economic development. Schools trap us inside a box that assumes several things. It assumes that people learn well in decontextualized settings. It assumes that people who do not have an education are destitute and uncivilized, and the Western world is unquestionably providing them with a positive service by forcing them into schools. And it also assumes that a person's worth is determined by their educational level and the degrees that they have accumulated. And all of this while contributing to dispossessing people of their land, degrading their environment, exploiting their poverty that is imposed on them, and systematically dismantling that which is important and sacred to them. As part of the process of development and progress, schooling has been offered as a human right that all peoples of the world should enjoy. And this package of human rights is considered universal. And here, Prakash and Esteva criticize the universality of human rights as a way of imposing Western values around the world. They offer as an important case study the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, which has one of the largest indigenous populations in this country. The tricky people of Oaxaca have their own indigenous system of justice that is restorative in nature, as opposed to the Western style of punitive justice. When a person violates a shared custom, he or she is perceived as someone in trouble who needs understanding and help, including the opportunity to offer compensation to the victim. If a person burns a part of the forest, that person must reforest it. If a man kills another, he must assume full responsibility for the welfare of the dead person's family for the rest of their lives. Rather than confine wrongdoers to jail, they seek to create experiences that encourage the doers of damage to reflect on the violence of their crime and to ensure adequate compensation. These practices are not conceived as forms of punishment, because it is assumed that the person is out of balance with the universe, so it's the responsibility of the community to lead the healing. Progressive educators are aware of some of the problems of the modern school, and one of the solutions they have come up with is the teaching of multicultural, or in some cases what some consider a more advanced, intercultural education. But Prakash and Steva believe that these forms of education are oxymorons. The world is so diverse and rich that the sterility of the classroom, with its clean structure and Cartesian logic, impedes the respectable inclusion of forms of knowledge that do not follow the logic established by modern institutions. The school is a literate world, and it protects highly specialized literate forms, along with hegemonic languages and other forms of expression considered part of, quote-unquote, high culture. Even more, When multicultural education takes forms of knowledge outside of their original context, it does violence to that knowledge. The authors wrote, "Can the same system that brought us Homo monolinguists be expected to transmit the 7,000 spoken cultures that constitute the richness of the lived pluriverse at the grassroots? Can the school cafeteria that brought us hot dogs and hamburgers palatably be the chosen political site for cultural workers to serve bojam, sushi, somtam, or the many other elaborate edible delicacies fully and inextricably embedded in the commons of the pluriverse?" Prakash and Steva are seeking to restore to prominence the everyday knowledge of people's lives. Some of the distinguishing features of everyday knowledge are that its meaning and use are context-bound, that it has utilitarian value, and that it is generally acquired through direct participation in real-world activities as part of the community. It's a collective form of consciousness that is associated with a strong sense of place, and it provides meaning to people's lives. The problem with schools, however, is that under the banner of multicultural education, the efforts to recognize the importance of local cultures is so feeble that the treatment is often a mile wide and only an inch deep, and consequently, there's a huge misrepresentation of local knowledge and worldviews. So what do Prakash and Steva offer as solutions? One strategy is for refusenik cultures to be created. Refuseniks opt out of the formal education system as a way of protecting their cultural and intellectual integrity. Prakash and Steva present the Zapatista indigenous movement in southern Mexico as an example. Zapatistas say no, they refuse to die out, to be beaten, to disappear. They know that to survive, they must drop out of the global race. If instead, they decide to run the race, they will drop out by dying. Why then not drop out in order to live and flourish? This is not necrophilia, say the authors. The cultures dropping out of the education development race are biophiliacs, that is, they love life. They are not alone in their quest for liberation from global development and education. They have each other and the solidarities of many others. In conclusion, Prakash and Steva provide a map of the educational landscape that grassroots cultures must traverse to pass on the values, knowledge, and skills needed to sustain themselves, locally as well as globally. The challenge to all of humanity is aptly summarized in the author's desire to create a pedagogical space that makes room for people of all cultures to be able to learn from life and to perpetuate themselves in an ecology of peaceful coexistence. Prakash and Steva finished their poetic manifesto by writing, "We hope you and your descendants will enjoy the dignity of your community, your culture, your places, your tribe, your ways of living and learning to regenerate your spaces. We hope we will not seek to smother your cultural spaces with our certainties, nor you ours. We hope you will be hospitable to our ways, and we to yours." I want to end this presentation with the words of Eduardo Galeano, one of the greatest writers from Latin America, from Uruguay, who died this week, and it's a great loss to all of us, because he always wrote on behalf of the poor, the vulnerable, the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, the voiceless, the people of the two-thirds world, the social majorities. In 1999, he wrote The Right to Delirium, a brief poem to welcome the new millennium, with the hopes that we will all change our ways and our planet, making it more just and beautiful for everyone. And Galeano wrote, "What if we were to fantasize, even for a moment? Let's project our vision beyond the current world of infamy and imagine another possible world. A world where the air will be clean of every poison, where in the streets cars will be run over by dogs, where people will not be driven by cars or programmed by computers or watched by televisions, where people will work to live and not live to work, where economists will not call the level of consumption the standard of living, nor will they confuse the quantity of things with the quality of life, where learning will not be a commodity but free like the air and the sunsets. Where the church will add to the tablet of Moses another commandment: love nature, of which you are a part. Where we're the brothers and sisters of all who want justice and beauty in the world, no matter where they're born, or where they live, or who they decide to love. The best thing of the world is the amount of worlds it has yet to be discovered. Well, that's it, dear friends. Be kind to one another, and let's create new systems of learning where we truly honor the pluriverses of the world. Bye-bye.